We'll give him a quick mic check when he's ready. Mr. Wilson, I see you've joined us. Can you hear and see us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Mayor, everyone is here and ready when you are.
Thank you. Good evening or good afternoon, everyone. This is the Town Board work session for June 1st, 2020. The goal of this work session is to have the Town Board receive information on topics of town business from the town manager, town attorney, and town staff in order to exchange ideas and opinions regarding these topics. Any member of the public in attendance is asked to be recognized by the mayor before participating in any discussions of the Town Board. Tonight on our agenda, item number 1 is small wireless facilities. And I understand that Mr. Eisenbrun is our staff member that's going to lead us in this discussion. So with that, Mr. Eisenbrun, I'll throw it to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mayor. And just for not look like we have any attending right now, but we did also invite the Planning Commission to this work session as well, as they're a critical role and part of the process typically for approving small or regular wireless facilities. So with that, we'll get started here. This is probably going to be the first of maybe a couple of different work sessions as we work through some of your concerns tonight, some information that we're going to be learning about, and just kind of how the town wants to proceed. So with that, my computer will catch up. There we go. What are small facilities and kind of what are the goals? So they're really kind of this new emerging trend that we're seeing across basically all sorts of wireless infrastructure. We're going to start to see them more densely placed. And right now, our current municipal code does not really speak to them as far as how we want to protect kind of our community and what that looks like. And so tonight's goals is we're going to better learn what they are, how they're regulated, kind of what Windsor has currently and what our neighbors are doing, and then how we want to move forward and take a kind of a next dive into that. So a little bit of background for you all. The town, along with a whole bunch of other communities across the Front Range in Colorado and really around the world even, are facing kind of this next wave of technology, a lot of questions around it. And based on its density and its design, there's a lot higher potential to impede on the general public's kind of perceived safety or aesthetic values and kind of how we enjoy our community. These small cell facilities will typically or are more apt to include 5G networks. And I know there's been a lot of kind of discussion and maybe even some concern around 5G and some of the frequencies it uses, which is like a shorter wavelength, which is also why they need to be placed more densely. So typically they're around 600 feet, but they can be all the way up to 300 feet. Whereas our typical cell towers right now, kind of known as 4G, are spaced at 2 miles or more apart. When you look at typical providers and what they need for spacing requirements. So it's just kind of a whole different, I guess, infrastructure technology. And it's really designed to gear towards our emerging technology in our other vehicles in our daily life. So, autonomous vehicles or how we kind of interact with the smart city concept, all those sort of things. So what is it exactly? Basically, it's just an overarching term for that wireless network site with these lower radio frequencies. They produce a little bit lower power footprint and consequently range as well. And so you'll see kind of a few different examples. And essentially they work together. Instead of being standalone facilities, they work in tandem to create like a macro network. And again, ultimately, these are to kind of help work with autonomous vehicles, smart cities. This can also include internet and basically higher cell speeds because they can handle a lot more data. And so the pictures on the right, these are all basically examples in and around the Denver metro, as they're kind of really starting to see this emerging trend at their front doorstep. The biggest difference is pretty obvious, hopefully, but in comparison to the traditional towers, where we regulate them at a maximum height of 50 feet, but they can go much higher if needed be. These small cells are the size of, some say like a pizza box or a small refrigerator, and they can be mounted on pretty much any type of pole. So whether it's a street light or a power pole, it can be on pedestrian style poles or more typical Cobra headlight poles. They've gotten pretty creative in ways in finding how to attach them to all sorts of different structures, and they're allowed as a use by right in all rights of way.
David,
yes.
Do you think we're seeing your screen? Because we're not. And are we supposed to be following along with the slide deck in the packet?
So,
or at least I'm not seeing your screen.
Okay.
Thanks.
I would. Yes.
See your screen. The sound is really broken.
Oh, I can hear him okay. I just
Okay.
am not seeing what he's referring to.
Are other people able to see my screen?
I can see the screen and I can hear you. It's just David.
I can see the screen.
Yeah, I can see your screen share and hear you, David. So I'm not sure what's up with Sislowski.
Let's see.
Hey, yeah, David, in the board chambers, the mayor and I and Jess all see your screen, so I'm not sure why Mr. Sawatzky is not.
I mean, you don't have to admit happy hour on a work session, but we'll understand if it is.
I now found it. I can put it in a tiny little window up in the right-hand corner, but let's see if I can. There.
If you scroll to the bottom right of that tiny window, it should show an expand screen icon.
Yep, I did do that. I've got it on full screen. Thank you.
Okay. So again, to kind of pick off where I left off, these small cell facilities, we can really start to see them show up in a lot of different areas throughout our town as a use by right in a lot of ways, or as a conditional use. But either way, they're going to be kind of knocking on our front door here, probably sooner rather than later. And so that's, again, part of the reason why we're taking a look at this. So some of the existing regulations that are out there that are in place by the Federal Communications Commission is basically, again, making these small cells a use by right in any zone district. So that's just kind of like a blanket statement they put out there, similar to how, for instance, churches are allowed by as a use by right in any zone district. However, they're still subject to our regulations. And so if they can't meet those, then they go through the conditional use process. They also added a shorter time clock. So part of the 2017 and 2018 amendments that we have made in our code were to update these shot clocks that the FCC has put in place. And now they've kind of added these 2 new shot clocks for small cell facilities. And then it also provides, again, that federal mandate saying it is a use by right to locate on municipalities or government agencies, their light poles, traffic signals, and other infrastructure in the right of way. Furthermore, they have basically left pretty much very minimal amounts of room or interpretation as far as what we're allowed to regulate. We can't necessarily regulate how dense they are, and we have to respond within a certain amount of time. And so our hands are definitely a little bit tied in comparison to other land use applications, but we do have some regulations as well. Lastly, a couple of the new, some of the new regulations that came in effect of 2019 that have, I think, kind of re-triggered this discussion are these new shot clocks that basically put a little bit tighter burden on the municipality. So we've got a 90-day shot clock for brand new kind of freestanding poles. So that would be something where if the carrier came in and say, hey, we want to put this standalone pole in your right of way, we'd have 90 days to get that complete application and respond back to them. Or we'd have 60 days if they say, hey, we want to come and attach to your street light or something to that effect. It also limits what we can charge as a municipality, so we can't make it onerous or out of reason, and that we can't basically materially inhibit any of these facilities by adopting regulations that would make it essentially impossible for them to locate. And lastly, it really governs these aesthetic standards, and that we need to be reasonable and objective, and that we can't be burdensome on them. So a few things that our neighbors are doing and how they've addressed this. Fort Collins, for instance, has basically just a hierarchical process. So you'll kind of just see some of their examples in how they regulate small cell facilities. So for instance, their number one is they just want to co-locate on a pole. They know that they can't say, nope, we can't do it. But they say, hey, you have to come in, you have to replace our pole. If you're going to co-locate on it with something that can basically withstand that new structure. If you can't do that, you can go to a third-party pole where they have their own maintenance agreements. Their third preference, for instance, is a traffic signal pole. And lastly is just a freestanding pole that's brand new. Again, for the third and fourth preferences for them, for instance, a lot of municipalities have been trying to keep it out of intersections, again, just from a visual obstruction. If there's an accident there, there's that much more damage done. And it's just that much more visually impairing. So they're trying to kind of hide and keep these things more discreet. And obviously freestanding poles, they're just trying to minimize how many extra poles they have in their right of way. Excuse me. And then some of the other big topics that they look at and that is very touchy about are the frequency emissions. So a lot of people are concerned at what 5G waves might be producing, all those sort of things. And so the FCC is very careful to say, hey, you can't regulate on these perceived health benefits. However, you have to, as a carrier, they have to comply with, pretty stringent standards as far as their emissions, what they're doing. And so Fort Collins, for instance, makes them say, hey, you have to give us a diagram of where these kind of emissions are going and what that 100% maximum from the FCC, what that looks like and who might be affected and how you need to keep that out. And then you can go back, at most you can talk to each provider annually and say, hey, we need a report, of all your antennas saying, is everything in compliance? Is everything within these reasonable health standards that the FCC has put in? So those are just a few examples of what Fort Collins does. Aspen's a little bit more lenient. They just say, hey, here's how we want to see pole design. This is what we want to do. They're not quite as intense as Fort Collins is some of those routes, but they do talk about location and where they go. They also say, hey, if there's a preferred option within 200 feet, we want you to go on that pole. So if they're proposing a new pole, for instance, but there's a street light or a power line or something that they much rather attach them to, they can say, hey, we're going to reject your, or basically freeze your application for a new pole right now. And you need to go figure out if you can co-locate on an existing pole to basically not, again, clutter up the right of way. So again, this is kind of maybe part one in what we're looking at doing as a town, but we really just want to get a better understanding as staff for what direction the town would like to go in and what more information they're looking for. So again, things that we can address and what we can regulate is consistency and protection of things like view corridors. We can ensure that safety is done through like site triangles and all of our typical engineering standards. That this can also be modified outside of our basically typical code process. So as these amendments happen, we can do things either by resolution or we can just kind of stay up to date a lot easier. And then ultimately we can add things in like, hey, we prefer to have these attached to streetlights, or we want these all on third party ideally, or whatever you all decide. We can work through some of those preferences. Again, what we cannot regulate though is on these emissions from the radio frequencies. Obviously we can't discriminate against any type of providers. We can't make any of the regulations or fees prohibitive, and then we can't deny for basically any of the physical dimensions. We can't make anything overly burdensome, and we have to adhere to the FCC shock laws. So that's kind of like a 10,000 foot overview of what we're dealing with and kind of what's coming down the pike. But I'm happy to answer any questions and kind of figure out what direction and what more information you guys are interested in.
Mr. Mayor,
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Wilson has a comment or question.
Mr. Wilson?
Yeah, I received several, over the last probably year, I've received several people who came to me about the frequency and the health concerns and things like that. So thanks for educating me or us on the fact that that's really beyond our control. So if they have that concern, is that something they take to the federal level then, since it's an FCC thing?
So what I would first recommend is with each of these new applications, we would get letters in, and we can make them do a test once that new small cell facility is installed. We can say, hey, you need to go out there and test these RF emissions, and then they will send us a certified letter from an engineer back saying, yep, they're within the FCC regulations. They can show us what those emissions are, all those sort of things, and we can provide that information to the public or to that citizen, who's inquiring. I would say that's probably a lot more quick and effective than them trying to go up the chain and I don't know, probably into deaf ears.
Yeah, calling the congressman or something like that. And then I know some of the stuff they sent me, and I did not fact check it, so bear with me, would reference other communities that have banned it. I'm not saying that we'd ever try to do that, but from what you're saying, it sounds like that's not possible.
Correct.
I guess other communities.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean, that was it. So I'm not saying that we would ever do that, but if another community is trying to do that, it sounds like they're maybe challenging, what's coming down from, a higher jurisdiction.
Correct. Unless you really want to give, Kim and Ian a lot of extra work and brain damage, I would not recommend that. Again, the FCC has their mandates. There's kind of the opposite side of this. So you'll see in your memo, there's kind of a whole table as far as what other municipalities regulate and who does and who doesn't. There's a few of our local neighbors like Timnath and Berthoud who don't have any regulations, which that just means their default is whatever the FCC kind of minimums are. So they don't have preferences, they don't have design guidelines, anything like that. They just say, come in, comply with the FCC and be on your way. So that's kind of the no regulation side, but I would strongly advise against trying to prohibit this, from, again.
Yeah, no, I don't want to. I don't want to do that. It was more, how do I respond to people who suggest that? And so for me, it's really then turning to, how do we want to do anything, aesthetically, like where these go, what they look like, things like that.
Correct.
Mr. Sislowski, you have comment or question?
Yeah, thanks. A couple of them. I guess first, to respond to Barry's point, I think what I heard you say, David, is that they sort of have to give us environmental assessment at the time of install, but then we can ask that they do that once a year as well. Correct. And I don't know why we wouldn't, assuming that it's not overly burdensome to do that and we're permitted to do so. So why wouldn't we at least have that? Talk to me. So if I remember right, wasn't I hearing a short while ago about us potentially acquiring the light poles, at least in the downtown area of Windsor? I don't know that we own them currently. I'm not sure, but whether owned by Windsor or whether they're owned by the electric company, you're going to get this odd thing where the owner of the pole is going to have to consent in some fashion. If it's our pole, we can do that. What happens if it's owned by Poudre Valley REA or somebody else? And are we, Ian or Shane, were we moving forward or talking to them about buying the poles or replacing them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did a preliminary study with this group called Tanko Lighting. And so staff has received that report. We are going to schedule them for the board, I think, in June. The delay right now is because there's a pretty big CIP lift to purchase these assets. Right now, we've kind of held off having that report go to the board until staff knows if we're going to have the funds available to move forward next year. So we're waiting a little bit. We wanted to get a little bit more financial data before we brought that to the board so we could best advise you.
That will come, but it's probably 6 weeks out until we have something in front of you guys. I said June and I meant July. We're already in June. Sorry.
it seems to me if we don't own them, obviously, then it's almost a three-party discussion about putting anything on an existing light pole. I guess myself personally looking at this does seem to me to make some sense to try to have aesthetically pleasing. You know, we can't prevent it, but we can certainly follow Fort Collins' lead a bit to try to think about what would fit well within the, as best as possible, visually with the downtown area and aesthetically have some guidelines. I guess I had somewhat of a technical question. I'm not sure if anybody on this call would be able to answer, but I know that we have a couple places where our facilities are connected by line of sight. I think we have stuff out to Boardwalk Park. We have stuff to the Cultural Art Center. And I think there was a discussion about having a line of sight out to the sewer treatment plant. Would this in any way interfere with those line of sight operations? Or maybe more importantly, can we replace those line of sight operations and ask that the company installing these mini cells give us capacity to be able to connect our facilities instead of using line of sight?
Great question.
Yeah, that's a shame. So I don't think it would.
I think the second part of that is definitely a Corinne question, an IT question. It goes way beyond, I think, our technical capability in this room.
And Mr. Sawatzky, I know she is listening through YouTube, and there is a bit of a delay, and she's going to give me a response here shortly, or we can at least follow up and respond to the rest of you via email once we know.
I guess it's worth thinking about if there's any way that the network can, in fact, assist the town in connecting all of our various facilities and areas. It may be a nice, maybe a better route than trying to do our line of sight antennas. Okay, that's all I had. But I would certainly vote with following more of the Fort Collins model and also requiring the EPA or the environmental assessment report or whatever annually.
And the town
Mr.
does.
McCarter?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, David. No, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the planning department also does have a third-party reviewer who specializes in wireless telecommunications, and so they are the ones who aid and assist us in all of our new facilities currently. And so they could also probably provide us some technical insight too as we go down that road. We do have a good option kind of already on. Go ahead.
Mr. McCarter?
So in looking at the materials that were submitted by Mr. Eisenbrown today, I did notice some statutory limitations on in-kind assessments by local governments. So instead of having them pay us a fee, we could work for get capacity in their systems. That appears to be prohibited. And so, David, Mr. Soslowski, are you suggesting that we do that? If it's we won't charge you a fee, but just let us on your system. I don't think we can do that. But was that the direction you were going?
I hadn't thought necessarily, Mr. McCarter, about if there'd be compensation or how it's paid for. Obviously, if we could ask for an in-kind, it might be nice. Assuming for a moment that this technology would help us connect, then it sounds like the option would be to ask them what would it cost.
Sure.
And compare that to what it would cost for us to do line of sight. Because I know at least line of sight, we are a little challenged in some of the areas, particularly the water treatment plant. So anyway, we'll find out.
Yeah, that's just an observation that I took away from the materials that were submitted earlier.
Okay.
Is there anyone else got a comment or has their hand raised?
Mr. Bennett?
Bennett.
I just raised my hand. Yeah, following up on Mr. Sawatzky's question about the in-kind and Mr. McCarter's, is there any way that this technology could be used to extend service or give option services to some neighborhoods that are not well served presently?
That's a great question, Ken, and I don't have that answer right now. and I have Corinne listening in, and we're gonna make sure we can try to find some answers or a way to research that for sure.
And are you talking about a network, Wi-Fi stuff, cable sort of thing?
Several of our neighborhoods have a very limited service.
Right.
So
You mean
if there's
high-speed
a way
internet?
more competition, if through this technology, a resident could have a choice between provider A and provider B, you get more competition, you get better service, is my thinking.
Corinne, you're going to be busy.
Mr. Balstead, you had a comment?
Yeah, I guess we would have to work with IT on all of these technical questions and what the advantages of the new technology might be. One of the concerns that planning staff had in working on this in the past is obviously the aesthetics and the proliferation of the small poles. And I guess I just wanted to ask if the board shared that concern and wanted to look at anything in terms of, I guess we're limited in what we can do, as David pointed out, but whatever we could do to try and minimize duplication of poles and the proliferation, if that's something that the board's interested in.
I would certainly welcome that discussion.
Ms. Eno, you have comment?
Yes, I was just going to indicate that the design of the 5G, the small cell network, is designed to speed internet as well. So it might actually, if the poles are located in those areas that are underserved right now, at least according to all of my research, it does appear that it could increase their speed and abilities in those areas.
Mr. Bennett, you have comment or question?
Yes, to Scott's question about the aesthetics, absolutely. Aesthetics is probably my number one concern. And I like the Fort Collins model, as some other people have said. Regarding their fourth option of freestanding small cell, I'm wondering if we can have any design standards on what those poles look like. I mean, just broadly, could it look like a tree, or does it look like something that fits in our neighborhoods or in our community versus just another steel pole standing up? So the aesthetics are a big question for me.
It would be tough to require that, so when we do see monopoles right now that are the freestanding towers that look like pine trees, monopines more or less, or palm trees or something else. That's because part of that whole tower structure, is all those different co-location options for other providers, all those sort of things, where these are so much smaller that if we did want it to be a freestanding sign, I'm not sure, and it would be a good research question for me to dive into a little bit more, but I'm not sure how they would kind of camouflage it with a tree or something of that nature. That's why you see a lot of these places just putting it on top of light poles or street lights where there's already maybe other cameras or other equipment up there. So it's just kind of one more little piece versus maybe what could be a pretty crazy fake looking tree just sitting out there. So, but worth looking into. So I'll definitely do that. Thank you for your question.
David, did you have another question for us?
I was just following only because Scott kind of asked, Mr. Balstead asked what the board was thinking in terms of our approach. And I just wanted to reiterate what I said earlier, that I do think aesthetics are important and would prefer to follow the Fort Collins model, I think, as being a little careful in terms of what things looked like, where they were placed, as much as we can.
Mr. Wilson?
Yeah, I'll just say that I'm on board with something similar to the Fort Collins model as well. I think it's very well done.
I know that Ms. Malone joined us by video now.
Add comment to this, didn't she?
Or Corinne.
Or was it Corinne? I'm sorry. Was it Corinne? I'm sorry, Carlin. Not trying to call you out there, sorry. I got Corinne and Carlin mixed up, I'm sorry. Corinne, did you want to?
You could add the Carlin and I look a little bit alike, so.
It's a compliment. We have looked into other options. We've been in contact with a representative from SICLU, which is some of the technology that we use for our current point-to-point system that goes between different buildings. It's a short range type of idea. So it has very similar features that 5G would provide. SICLU has done some implementations for town technology, so bringing 5G into some towns. So that is an interesting area that we want to continue to explore for town purposes. They want to actually as a third-party vendor, but for town purposes, we focus solely on bringing fiber connectivity in that kind of way through wireless capabilities in order to give town employees access at various locations. So I'm happy to join in any conversations, especially with the third-party points of contact that you have, and discuss better ways that we could do it in the future.
Were there any other comments or questions?
Mr. Soslowski, your hand is still up. Do you still have something to add, or did I just forget to lower it for you?
Mr. Zaslowski, you might have to start over because we can't hear you.
You're on mute, sir.
Yeah, thanks. And my hand is still up. Corinne, thanks for joining us. I don't know if you heard earlier on YouTube, but I kind of asked two questions of whether this network might in any way interfere with our line of sight systems that we have in place. But also, is there a chance that it could replace those and still provide us with at least equal or even better connectivity with our various facilities using this 5G small cell network instead? And I think you said it could.
Ms. Millington, you have to unmute yourself there.
I can't get to her fast.
Okay, thank you. There's a chance that it could interfere with some of our signals as well, but we're able to tune our signals pretty precisely to try to avoid anything like that. And it would be great to, of course, work with these people and partner with them in order to save costs for ourselves. We don't have access to very many poles, as I heard people talking about earlier. So we've had to be pretty innovative on how we do that for the town. We've had to place them on buildings and do different things like that. So aesthetically, it would be better to have something that was more appropriate to be able to do that in the future. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to partner and save costs. Does that answer your question, David? Was there?
Yeah, I think that as part of the conversation, I think following Fort Collins in terms of a regulatory model is one thing, but then I think as we're approached, part of that conversation and dialogue, it seems to me ought to be, we'd like them to be here. And oh, by the way, if you put one over at Boardwalk Park, it'll enable us to connect easier there. And can we, just when we're talking to the service providers, whoever they are, to see if there's a way that they can help us at a cost. Yeah. Thanks.
So I don't see any other comments or questions from anybody that is joining us. So with that, does staff have direction? Does the staff need direction on?
This is from the board. Do you feel like you have it, or do you feel like we need to go around and make sure you got it?
Well, Mayor, thank you. Everybody that I heard speak seems to favor the Fort Collins model. So I think what I would suggest is we could just try to localize that for a draft for Town of Windsor and bring that back to the board. And so obviously we have at least one more workshop ahead of us here.
Okay.
So I think we just bring this back. David doesn't seem like he has much on his plate, so we should be able to get that done in the next week or two. No, I'm kidding, David. But we'll bring that back soon to the board. And unless anybody, I don't know if I heard from Mr. Talon or Mr. Carpentier, but I think everybody else seems to really favor the Fort Collins model right now.
Mr. Talon, do you have any objection to the Fort Collins model?
No, I don't have any objections. It seems like they've done a lot of work on it. I don't see where we could, we probably improve on it or in some way, but I think let's go with that and move forward.
Mr. Carpentier.
Same thing. Doesn't seem like we have a whole lot we can do about it or say about it, but we want to be part of technology. My question is for maybe another time, and how we can use that system to kind of push back Wi-Fi through the town somehow. I don't know. Just a different time maybe, but that's what I'm thinking.
Well, and I want to remind town board that the town board will have the opportunity to see this again. Like they said, once Mr. Eisenbraun in a couple weeks has this, no, I'm just kidding. Has the ability to re-prepare this for us, we will, be able to see it again before obviously it moves forward. So,
two quick questions for you, Mayor and board members. If we're going to be looking at the Fort
model for the small cells, do you want to look at the Fort Collins model for the rest of the wireless code at all? Because they have, additional design standards and guidelines and specifications that go a little bit more in depth than what we currently have for all of our towers and wireless facilities. And then kind of part two of that question is the next time you see it, would you also like to see a draft ordinance with that?
any thoughts from the board? I can give mine. Go ahead, Mr. Sawatzky.
Mayor, sorry. Well, I guess, Dave, your question as to whether we're broadening our scope here, I don't have a problem with that, but I haven't seen what Fort Collins has in these other areas. So if you're asking us to consider it, I don't mind considering it, but I'd ask you to probably do a side-by-side of what we have, what they have, and kind of point out some of the major differences. And at the same time, then perhaps, give your insights or advice as to what's good about theirs or what's bad compared to what we have. I don't have a problem, though, broadening it.
I guess I would throw it out there for us to be able to review what it is, is being proposed. Maybe
Language for adoption.
Okay. So hold off on the draft ordinance for the time being?
I would until we get a chance to see the final product. I'm not speaking for the whole board. I'm looking for anybody that has a comment contrary to that can speak up. But I would personally like for us to see it again before we're being looked to adopt it. Okay. With that, we'll move on to item number 2 tonight on the agenda, which is future meetings. Next Monday night, we, as a part of our work session, have the 2019 financial audit presentation and a harassment video. Mr. Hale, I'm assuming those are obviously 2 separate things. But,
well, let's hope so. Yes, so we have our 2019 audit, so the auditor will be here to just present the findings to the board in a work session. Of course, you'll be asked to formally adopt the audit that evening. And then CIRSA requires a harassment video for everybody, including elected officials. So we'll have a brief CIRSA video, and I think that's maybe 20-25 minutes.
Okay. And then obviously a regular town board meeting next Monday, which will begin at 5. The 2 weeks from tonight, we will, as our work session, we will be doing District 4 vacancy interviews, and I believe in talking to Ms. Eicher, there was a total of 5 applicants that have applied for that vacancy. I could be wrong. I think it's 5. So that will take some time that evening. And then the following Monday night, June 22nd, that person that is selected for that vacancy will be sworn in time for the board meeting that evening. So, and then the June 29th is the 5th Monday of this month, and there will be no meeting unless something's pressing, but as of right now, we will remain with no meeting that night. So with that, Mr. Hale, did you have anything else that you'd like to talk about with future meetings?
Yes, Mayor. I just want to add that we have since scheduled our strategic planning meeting kind of after that June 22nd meeting and before the 29th. So staff will be sure to update that on our calendar.
Okay.
Mr. Soslowski has his hand raised, sir.
Mr. Soslowski?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mayor. Thanks.
I guess the only question on that June 15th, the District 4 interviews, I assume that we're going to have a fairly choreographed process for this with a consistent list of questions that we'll ask each candidate. Will that just be prepared by Shane, Mr. Hale, and his staff, or are we being asked to suggest questions we might want asked?
We do have a
I'm not quite certain that we've ever added any.
Yeah, so let us do this. I think from the last time we filled a vacancy, we still have those questions. We can send those out to the board like tomorrow, and you guys can look at them. And then if you have any changes you'd like to make, obviously you have that capability, but that'll give you a couple weeks to look over them and make sure we're getting to what you want to get to.
It is a scripted process from the process that I went through 4 years ago, where it is different questions being asked by different existing town board members, and then after the last interview, typically there's deliberations at that point by the town board, and then we will come to a decision as to how we would like to proceed. So. That answer your question, Mr. Soslowski? I'm assuming the rest of the board does not have a problem to see what the questions are in advance. Mm-hmm. They are pretty wide, ranging series of questions. I do remember from 4 years ago that it was the questions are kept in confidentiality of the board, only so that the applicants do not have a chance to necessarily prepare knowing what those questions are in advance. So with Mr. Hale or Ms. Humphrey sending those out tomorrow, or Ms. Eicher, that they are kept amongst the board so that they're kept close to the vest, so all applicants have the same ability to be asked those questions as they're presented to them.
Okay, Mayor, I think what you described from your experience, while different board members may ask questions, the same questions are asked of each candidate.
That is correct. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
The process 4 years ago was each applicant was given 15 minutes with the board for the questions to be asked, and then if the applicants had any questions of the board, that they would like a response to. So each interview took about 15 minutes apiece, and obviously we've got 5 applicants at this point, so we'll be doing interviews for more than an hour at that rate. If that format still is okay with Ms. Humphreys, Ms. Eicher, and the board. So for me, it is. I think that's typically been sufficient time to be able to have enough time to respond to each question that's asked.
Will we see their resumes or whatever they submitted in advance?
Yes.
Yes.
It'll be just kind of part of a normal board packet. We'll just, do we keep those confidential, who's applied?
I will triple check. I think they're confidential.
Yeah, so it'll be similar to that. We'll get it out like a packet, but it may not be actually visible on the web or anything. And then I just wanted to add, I think to manage this, and we've done this with other interviews, like for example, when we interviewed architects for the town hall remodel, we basically will set up 5 different Zoom meetings And so it'll be a way to make sure that applicants can't get in and watch the interview beforehand. It'll be a way for us to contain it towards just the board and the applicant. And so after each interview, we'll basically just log into a new one. So there's no way for anybody to hear the answers beforehand or to linger on. So we'll be able to manage that as well.
And I know the process 4 years ago was not televised, out to the community at that point. So again, to try to keep it concise so that applicants don't have a way to know what was answered, before them or after them, et cetera. So it is kind of a closed meeting amongst the board. Okay, well, with that, we will conclude tonight's work session. I thank you all for joining us tonight. May you have a wonderful evening. And with that, we will be done. Have a good evening.